Hi again, folks. Welcome back to Tomaskycast, a production of New Republic Video. I'm Michael Tomasky. I'm the editor of the New Republic, and my guest in this edition is Mr. David Pepper. You see him right there. David is the former chairman of the Ohio State Democratic Party, and he's with me because he's just written a really fascinating and important book called Laboratories of Autocracy. And I'll let him explain where that title comes from. I hope a New Republic person would already know where that title comes from, but David can tell you. And it's a really, really interesting and an important book. So I wanted to bring him on here to talk about that and to talk about the politics of his state generally. David Pepper, welcome.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
Yeah, thank you for joining us. So tell the folks, what's the thesis of Laboratories of Autocracy?
Sure, and I assume your readers will recognize the title that we've often thought about states, and Justice Brandeis coined the term as laboratories of democracy.
Yeah.
In this very sort of positive view. And there have been times where they've served that role, be it around the New Deal or even Romney care leading to Obamacare. But there's also a really, dark side that states have played in various parts of our history. Jim Crow was not a federal law. It was state house after state house after state house. And the point of the book is to say, sadly and disturbingly, that over the last several decades, really the last generation, in Ohio and many states, that these state houses, who have a lot of power, they have a power over elections. They can gerrymander and draw districts, as Donald Trump knows all too well. They can meddle with the electoral college process. With all those powers, in recent years, for a lot of reasons, they are playing that very negative role again. And I hate to be bleak about it, but if not stopped, they will be the front line in really undermining our democracy for good at the federal level, more than Marjorie Taylor Greene ever will, because state houses have a huge amount of control over so much of our democracy. And it's something that I'll stop talking in a second. It's something the founders themselves understood was a risk. And I walked through that they knew that if you let state houses themselves become undemocratic, which they've become in too many states, that they could threaten not just their own states, but actually the well-being and democracy of the whole country. And so the book walks through that, how it developed in states like Ohio, but then it goes through all the things we have to do to push back before it's too late.
So what's happened in these last 15 years in a nutshell? Or so.
So what's happened is, in the 2010 election was obviously a huge moment here. And I happened to be a candidate running for a statewide office. And so I saw it up close, especially since 2010, although a lot of the legwork started years early with the Koch brothers and groups like ALEC really starting to get their tentacles into state houses. But after 10, there was a sweep around this country where Republicans took over state houses. And over that decade, really got, I call the book Laboratories of Autocracy for a reason. They really are functioning in that way, that they are always trying new things, always learning new things from both failures and successes. And over that time, we've essentially seen a really a nonstop and accelerating attack on democracy. The first it was after 2010, what were all the reasons that Obama turned states like Ohio blue? And these state houses quickly targeted the ways that happened and threw up roadblocks so it wouldn't happen again. And it worked to a lot of degree. In Ohio, it was purging, it was cutting back on early vote. In other states, there's other things. Then we get to 16 and 18, and then we start to see precursors to today. When some Democrats won statewide offices in 16 and 18, these state houses didn't just rig elections for themselves. They started attacking the successful Democratic candidates statewide, be it Cooper in North Carolina, be it others in Michigan and Wisconsin. So you see an ever-growing extremism and aggression from state houses who, again, have a lot of levers over our democracy that people don't know about. I go through in the book some of the reasons why this is happening. And a fundamental reason is that no one's paying attention to these places.
Yeah.
That state and local media are dying. So there's very little coverage of these places. And then I go through something that I think is really lost right now in our country, which is as a result of those weaknesses in these state houses, and the 2010 very extreme gerrymander, 2011 gerrymander, we're essentially living with a generation of state house leaders, majorities, who themselves have never really been through a democratic process. They are sitting in power, most of them having never really won a real election. And they've also figured out that if they faced a real democracy, they would most likely lose that power. And so they're very hard at work doing everything they can to keep that real robust democracy from playing out in their states out of self-preservation. And I don't even think Karl Rove, when he was an orchestrator of the wins in 10 and the gerrymandering of 11, I don't think he appreciated even himself how warped things get when you literally have in power in state after state a whole generation that themselves have never been through elections. They haven't had to talk to swing voters. All they know is extremism and getting reappointed being extremist. And why that's why I think this is accelerating. And one other thing that I put in the book, there's sort of this misconception that, well, this is all happening because of the big lie. And that's why after 2020, the big lie is only the latest iteration of this.
Right.
This has been going on and accelerating way before the big lie, which adds fuel to the fire. But this is happening, again, this predates Trump. Trump only has given them the most recent sort of extra, energy to attack the reasons that he lost in 20. But this goes way before that. It's a long game. And as I say in the book, until we start responding to it as a long game and a true battle for democracy, the side attacking democracy, it will keep winning.
Yeah. Well, money is a big part of the story here, right? And groups like the American Legislative Exchange Council and others. I mean, why did the right do that? I mean, I was aware of the right doing that, investing in state capitals for years, while liberals just weren't. Why did the liberal side let that happen?
Well, let me just say on the Republican side, I mean, what the Koch brothers and ALEC, the Legislative Exchange Council mentioned, what they figured out, which the book explains, is that in which the founders worried about, like I said, Madison wrote a lot about this. The Achilles heel of American governance are state houses. And they've weaponized that Achilles heel. That's what ALEC and the Koch brothers have done. And they're doing it because they realize that their agenda of trickle-down economics and extreme measures actually would never succeed in a real democracy. So state houses are the one place they can go to ram through what is an unpopular minority viewpoint agenda and do it without any accountability for those who vote for it. So they figure that out, and it's working to a charm. All they want is paralysis in Washington. They don't need any activity in Washington except judges. Where they're on offense are in all these states. And unfortunately, and people are catching up to this, Democrats aren't thinking about this as a struggle for power. Mm-hmm. We too often are waiting for that exciting, dynamic candidate at the highest level to get us excited, as opposed to figuring out, actually, in America, the way our system is set up is there are many levers of power, and many of them are in the hands of state house people that, unless you pay attention, you'll never heard of, who aren't as exciting as Barack Obama, aren't as public as Donald Trump, but have every bit the control over democracy that those people have. So if you don't pay attention to all these levers of power, someone on the other side is going to seize them all. And that's what's happened. So we are catching up. Eric Holder is running an operation to try and catch up. But be clear, they've been doing this for years. Yeah. And they currently have their hands on the levers of power that let them rig elections, let them change voting rules. And so if we don't play a very aggressive game of catch up, they have the opportunity to frankly, in the next couple of years, really, strike the death knell against a democracy we now think about.
Yeah, and I assume that gerrymandering figures in here at the state level just as much as it does at the congressional level.
Absolutely. I mean, first they rig their own districts.
Yeah.
And then they rig the districts for those in Congress. Yeah. But make no mistake, this is the first step here is all about self-preservation. So when Obama won Ohio in 2008, Democrats also won the state house. Yeah. Again, by the way, the state house had been gerrymandered in 2001 for Republicans. So when they came back after 2010 and started re-gerrymandering, changing the rules, the first priority wasn't just, again, the presidency. It was their own power. It was that we don't ever want to lose the State House of Ohio again or the governorship. So when we have the chance, we're going to rig our own districts to start. Then we'll get to work on the federal stuff. And that's right now the case at the Ohio Supreme Court. The first case is their attempt to rig their own districts.
Yeah.
The second case will be Congress. And that's why I say, these are people literally who have set up a system where they themselves feel no accountability and essentially never face the voters. They're like reappointed every 2 years.
Yeah.
And so to ask them, as Donald Trump and others will in the future, hey, do for us what you do for yourselves, it's just not that big an ask. It's frankly all they've ever known.
Yeah. Yeah. Your state legislature surprises me from time to time, not in a good way, with some of these like really extreme anti-abortion things that they come up with. And then there's the corruption and the scandal of recent vintage. Just tell people about like why is like you think of Ohio and you think it's not, South Carolina. It's not like one of those, it's not Texas. And yet your state legislature is like South Carolina on steroids.
Yeah.
How'd that happen?
And let's be clear, Wisconsin's the same way. Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. Well, the academics will tell you gerrymandering shifts the ideology of a state house way beyond the ideology of that state for a variety of reasons. They don't worry about reelection. They only worry about their next primary. They can get away with being extreme and never be punished for it. And their interest groups in their face, like the NRA, pushing them to do all these things. So it automatically becomes that. And we have examples where, interestingly, school board races all over Ohio, where people were running on this right-wing message around masks and vaccines and being against them. A lot of those extreme school board candidates, even in conservative areas, lost terribly. Those same people pushing those same policies will be reelected in the state house without any concern because of gerrymandering. So the extremism that wouldn't survive regular politics, even in conservative places, would actually is politics as usual at the state house. And here's what's happening that I think gets lost too.
Let me just interrupt you for 1 second, because they can't gerrymander school districts. Is that?
School boards are the district. It's just the district. Just like, they actually literally had in Mason, Ohio, a very conservative town. They passed a ban on abortions a couple months ago. The leaders of the people who passed that ban were up for re-election in November. They lost. The city council the other day repealed the measure. So that's a conservative town, but it's a non-gerrymandered town. So extremism didn't even survive there. The lesson is it's the gerrymandering that allows the extremists to be protected in office. And so whether in school board races and city hall races are sort of a control group that shows you throw that kind of craziness into regular politics, even in conservative areas, it loses. People don't want that kind of crazy stuff. But in a gerrymandered world, it's not only not what costs you your election, it's how you get ahead. And so you have I go through in my book, one chapter, the incentives are in a world of gerrymandering are so the opposite of everything that we want in politics. It breeds extremism. You get rewarded for it. Public outcomes actually don't matter at all. You can have the most failed policies. We've seen them in Ohio. Our schools are cratering in terms of public, measures. Our healthcare measures are in the low 40s now. That as we think of Ohio as one of the great states. By any measure, we're failing, but none of that matters in a world of rigged elections. You get reelected by keeping the private groups that run for-profit charter school scams happy, even if your local school district is cratering. That's how you get reelected. So all the worst incentives that would lead to bad outcomes are actually how you succeed in this world of gerrymandering. And that's one reason they have to keep gerrymandering going. If the group of people right now in Ohio or a lot of states with the same situation, given their records of failed outcomes, outright corruption, which we have, Ohio #1 in the country, extremism, if these people face, the same voter electorate that those school board candidates or city hall candidates face, they would all lose.
Yeah.
They literally have to keep rigging these districts in order to keep doing what they're doing because they know they'd lose. So and that's why we see this downward spiral. Every one of these negative things is building on each other. And so a state like Ohio is not just legislating like Alabama or Mississippi, but we're also starting to get the public outcomes of the worst states in the country.
Wow. That's really,
yeah. It's pretty sobering. Now, just to be clear, before everyone gets too depressed, I spend the final third of the book walking through all the ways to fight back.
Okay.
So and there are many examples and case studies. And Stacey Abrams, who happens to be a law school classmate of mine from Georgia, she shows you, if you think about this as a long game, as a battle for democracy that has to be waged in all 50 states, if you understand where the levers of power really are, which is not just in who the president is, and you sort of frame your politics accordingly, you can make real progress. But the current model of how Democrats are fighting this battle too often is exactly what the other side wants and will succeed with if we don't change what we're doing.
So what's an example of that? What's an example of Democrats playing into their hands?
Battling only swing states every 4 years and a few Senate swing races, as opposed to figuring out, contest every district in every state all the time.
Yeah.
Virginia was a state. Now, obviously, it was disappointing what happened with the governor's race, but they overturned over several cycles a gerrymandered Republican legislature.
Yeah.
One reason, they ran candidates in almost every district. The only time that Ohio Democrats picked up seats in the Ohio legislature that were, again, gerrymandered badly in 11 was when we ran a candidate in every single district. You got to fight this stuff everywhere. Yeah. What they want silence. They want unchallenged gerrymandered incumbents. They want a dying local media. So one of the philosophies I go through in the book and these solutions is do everything you can to disrupt their ideal state. And that means fight for democracy in all 50 states, do it every year like they do. ALEC fights for it everywhere. Yeah. There are conservative right-wing think tanks in Vermont and Hawaii.
Yeah.
Why? Because they're fighting this battle everywhere.
Yeah.
If they're on offense in 50 states and we play defense in 15 and rarely go anywhere else, we're guaranteeing them victories. And again, going back to the model of laboratories of autocracy, anytime they have a success in one state, they learn from it and replicate it in states across the country. So if you give them 25, 30 states to do things in, every time any of those states, and we see Ohio's had our purging is being replicated elsewhere. The Dropbox limitations that our Secretary of State did last year is being replicated elsewhere. In any state that they control, they take their successes and turn them into case studies that other states then mimic. So we can't afford to let them just dominate 30 states without even contesting it. We have to fight everywhere, every single year. And again, Stacey Abrams sees it this way. We have to understand there's a long game. In every campaign, win or lose, if you registered more voters, if you had conversations, if you narrowed the gap, you might have lost, but you made progress. Keep going. Don't just view it as a one-cycle deal. Oh, we lost, shame on everyone, move on. You've got to think of it as a long game. Again, Stacey's the best example. She didn't win the governor's race for a lot of reasons, but she engaged people. She registered tons of people over the last decade. All of a sudden, Georgia's blue in 20, but it's not all of a sudden. It's because she did all that work and she saw progress even in losses.
So let's talk about the midterms in your state. So the Senate race obviously has a lot of people watching it. Rob Portman's retiring. Tim Ryan's running on the Democratic side, Congressman from Youngstown. Probably Josh Mandel, I guess, on the Republican side, who's ran against Sherrod Brown once.
Yeah,
and has run for other races. Size that up. I mean, Ryan, seems like he might do a little better among the white working class than some other Democrats.
Yeah. I think, Sherrod Brown won in 18, and 18 was a relatively competitive year in Ohio. If this was in 18, Tim Ryan would beat Josh Mandel.
Mm-hmm.
I think he is a much better candidate. Josh Mandel is like Josh Hawley and worse. Okay. Imagine the worst, if you're watching this, imagine the worst person you're watching in the Senate. Josh Mandel is worse than that person. And so,
Give people an example.
I mean, go just follow. He's blocked me. Follow his tweet. I mean, it's truly unreal. Now, it's a cast of characters running in this Senate race.
Right.
J.D. Vance has destroyed whatever goodwill he built up from his book by showing he'll say or do anything to try and compete with Mandel, although he won't be able to. There's a woman, former chair named Jane Timken. She's been terrible, attacking masks and vaccines, and they're all doing whatever they need to do to make Trump endorse them. Yes. But they can't compete with Mandel. I mean, I don't even, it's just everything he does is just honestly horrific. And if you do any research, you'll see that. Now, the good news is I think he is so bad that he is the one guy who might scare moderate and even more conservative Republicans and independents to voting for Tim Ryan. I really think that. He's the opposite of the Youngkin model in Virginia. He can't hide how off the wall he is.
Yeah.
The risk is, though, if it's a bad year for Democrats, just like Rand Paul won a number of years ago when people thought he couldn't.
Right.
And I was, I celebrated with Jack Conway when Rand Paul won that primary, thinking, well, that guy's crazy. Well, look, he's been senator ever since. The risk of Mandel is if it's a bad year, he could win no matter what. But if it's relatively close, I actually think that's a good matchup for Democrats. I think Tim Ryan is a guy like Sherrod Brown who can campaign in all 88 counties. Mm-hmm. He knows how to talk to working people. He can pull some of them over who otherwise might vote for a Republican because he sort of lives and breathes, unions and hard work and hardworking people in a way that Mandel, I think, doesn't. So that would be the best matchup. Yeah. And if I were, running the DSCC, that would be the matchup I'd want. And I'd be, optimistic's too strong a word in the midterm in Ohio, but I'd play in that race. Yeah. And if the circumstances are right, I think Tim can win that election. And I think Tim's a very good candidate. Tim's always been a candidate who's has got as much raw natural talent as anybody you've seen. Uh-huh. I mean, when we needed a speaker to fire people up, that's who I'd call. Joyce Beatty I'd call as well, by the way. But the question for Tim is, he's never run a big league campaign before. Well, he's running a big league campaign. He's raising a lot of money. Uh-huh. He's all over the state. So he's actually putting together a really good campaign. And he is a very good candidate with raw talent and a good story. So he's right out of central casting to win. The question is the midterm environment. If Biden can recover and people can see that what Democrats are doing and see it beyond just a few cities, that's the environment where Tim can win. If it's a meltdown like 10 or 14, then it's tough. But I like the matchup if that's what it is. And I think that's what it will be.
Interesting. Okay. Then last thing, 2024, let's say it's Biden versus Trump. And let's say the economy's in pretty good shape and things are okay, and there's no real weight around Biden's ankle.
Yeah.
What kind of inside straight does he have to draw to have a chance to win?
Biden?
Yeah.
This is going to sound over the top, I guess. I think they would, if they ran a different candidate, they'd probably do better than Trump. Trump is scary and a sociopath, but he's also makes so many mistakes that my worry is a smarter Trump. A Trump who doesn't make mistakes and who thinks through every decision. So I think Biden-Trump is, take nothing for granted. They will do anything to win, including things through these statehouses that are, not legitimate. But I actually have always worried that a smarter, less mistake-prone candidate who does everything Trump does, but without all the negatives, without all the tweets, without all the crazy stuff, actually is more worrisome. So, and we saw with Terry McAuliffe, who's a good guy, good candidate, running the same person later. Sometimes it's hard to re-energize in that way. Yeah. So I think Biden can get reelected running against Trump. Honestly, I think Democrats need to fight really hard. And here's the other thing. And one reason, and you would know this. The reason Obama got reelected in Ohio and McCain ran at a very tough moment in 2008 Romney was a stronger candidate in a better environment to win. The reason Obama got reelected in Ohio, I believe, more than anything else, was the auto recovery. Mm-hmm. Everywhere in the state, people who work for autos or family or their town depends on it, forget the ads and the speeches. It was giving a guy credit that, you know what, he saved the industry that keeps our, we're second only to Michigan in terms of how we play a role in auto manufacturing, auto parts. That's, I think, the number one reason Obama got reelected. It was an understanding that Ohio voters, hey, that guy saved our industry. And that what Biden needs to do by 24, regardless of who he's running against, is have at least his infrastructure bill and the broader economy have that same effect. Yeah. Less because of a fancy ad, although messaging matters, but just an understanding and in some places maybe a grudging acceptance that this guy took a moment where America was really struggling and our state was struggling and our town was dying. And we have a new road, or not just the biggest bridge like the Brent Spence near where I'm sitting, but there's some smaller bridge near where these folks live that had been decrepit for years, but it's better. Yeah. And the main street looks better, or the job situation looks better, or there's some green energy. There's got to be some delivery on these bills that are passing that Tim Ryan can talk about when he runs, but that Joe Biden specifically can, and Sherrod Brown will be up that year too. Yeah, right. They can specifically say, we actually did something like the auto recovery that you felt in your community. And that means that these bills need to happen and be implemented, but it also means that Democrats have to get out and really communicate the difference it's making, not just in the biggest cities where people are already kind of on their side, but in all these smaller towns that some cases used to be Democratic places that are no longer voting with them. So one of my big beliefs is, whether it's Vilsack or Marcia Fudge or Buttigieg or Kamala Harris or Biden himself, get to these smaller towns that voted for Trump 60-40, if not 80-20, and actually walk to town and say, we're actually fixing this road that no one's fixed for 20 years. The State House didn't fix it because they're doing trickle-down economics. Mike DeWine didn't fix it. Donald Trump didn't do anything about it. We actually fixed it. Yep. And I think that's the kind of messaging that can give you a chance in 24 because you actually did something for these places. Yeah. And also, obviously, bigger cities, too. One of the beauties of some of this stuff is, Democrats too often are trying to micro-target. Yeah. Well, we can't talk to these people because we're talking to these people. That's a huge mistake. Well, on issues like infrastructure and healthcare, what smaller dying towns need is the same thing big cities need. Yeah. Just make sure you're going to those places and telling them this is for you too. And you'll actually get, you don't need to win these places, but you got to get back to 60-40 level losses like Obama had versus 80-20. And then you can win in states like Ohio, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. And I do think of all, despite all the, sausage making that doesn't look pretty right now, there's a lot of material in what they've passed that gives them the thing to talk about in 24 that can help them get reelected. They just need to make sure they're talking about it in the right way, in the right places.
If I didn't know any better, I'd think you'd read a Mike Tomasky column or two. Who knows?
Is there?
The man is David Pepper. The book is Laboratories of Autocracy, a really important book about how the right has taken over the state houses and what can be done about it. Please go take a look at it. Check out the book, Laboratories of Autocracy. David Pepper, thanks for joining me.
Thanks so much. Great talking to you.